All right, here we go.
While you're doing that, I'm going to eat some toast.
All right. G'day, Lewis.
No, fuck. I just said I was going to take a bite of toast. I warned you about this.
Yeah, but eating toast is good content. That's what the kids want these days.
Awesome.
Everyone wants toast. Everyone wants authenticity.
Oh, my God. This is an ASMR podcast.
That's a ASMR podcast with toast eating, yeah.
I just said, don't start now. I'm just about to take a bite. And then as soon as this was a goddamn stitch-up. My goodness. I'll never come on this program again.
We'll wait.
Okay. God, now I've eaten it so quickly and it felt dry and unenjoyable.
Magic. All right, here we go. If you like numbers and data and election predictions, this is the episode for you. But before we kick off, and as Lewis drinks some water to put down some toast, this is a quick reminder that we've got the Irrational Fear election special April 9th at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. Tom Ballard is performing. Alice Fraser is performing. John Domenica from The Chaser is performing, I believe, in their only Melbourne shows, which is great. Vijay Rajan and Mel McGlenzie are also joining us. And Lewis, last week I alluded to a special guest, a very special political guest. But we had to cut it out of the podcast last week because between recording that podcast and publishing that podcast, that guest said it would be too hard to share the stage with Tom Ballard politically.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I've said that myself. I don't particularly want to share the stage with Tom Ballard. He is funnier than me, and we have a similar work and career background. So it's never good for me to be too close to Tom.
But I have booked a new guest. Do you have any guesses who the guest might be?
Well, if it's someone who's willing to share the stage with Tom Ballard, it's got to be someone.
It is Chairman Mao. That's correct.
Yeah, I had to say, who's left of Bob Brown?
Actually, we've got someone on the polar opposite end. Belinda Greed. I don't know if you've seen Belinda Greed on Instagram, but she's running for the Liberals in Melbourne. She's going to be joining our panel. Lewis, have you heard of Belinda Greed on Instagram?
No, I haven't. I've only been in Melbourne a month or two. So I'm just sort of catching up with my Melbourne politicians. Is their tagline "Greed is good"?
Yeah,
if it's not,
it is something like that. Yeah. So Belinda Greed is joining us. She's a drag performer who is pretending to be a Liberal. So she's going to be joining us on stage for a hard-hitting interview about her life in the Liberals. Also, Lewis Hobart will be performing. I will be performing. Also, the whole show is stitched together by DJ Andy McClelland, who will be on stage too. It's going to be a fast, fun election hour. The show, if you want to get a ticket, the link will be in the show notes. All right. I'm recording my end of Irrational Fear on Gundagara land. Let's start the show.
The following program contains rude words like Mark Latham, blockchain, and Twitter. Irrational Fear recommends listening by immature audiences. Comedians, experts, laughing at the world as it burns down around us. This is a Rational Fear.
Tonight, Australians celebrate their $280 tax cut by buying milk and bread from Woolies rather than Aldi. And in his budget reply speech, Angus Taylor promises to put Coca-Cola in the bubblers. And after war plans leak on Signal, Elon Musk says that the future of war planning should be made on X instead. It's the 28th of March, and with more choreography and merriment than Severance, this is Irrational Fear.
This is a Rational Fear.
Welcome to Rational Fear. I'm your host, former Australian representative to the Venice Biennale, Dan Illich, and joining this week are a couple of numbers nerds. It's the Senior Insights Advisor for RedBridge and chronic podcast listener, Alex Fein. Welcome, Alex. Which podcasts have you given up on this year?
I don't give up. I just keep collecting.
And when he's not talking up the hot topics on Sunrise, he's whispering in the ears of Richard Branson and Malala Yousafzai. For popularities, it's Ed Coper. Whose ears have you been whispering into lately?
Well, I like to get all their heads together and whisper just very quietly. That's how I bring people together. So, that's obviously I cannot divulge who I'm whispering into, but everyone leans in really close. You'll be able to hear it.
And also from the Irrational Fear podcast, it's Lewis Holber. Welcome, Lewis.
Hello. Yes. What a delight to be here for the 1000th time.
In a moment, we're going to break down the electorate in the upcoming Australian election. But before we do that, here is a message from this week's sponsor.
Trying to get a war planning group chat that gets your juices flowing? Sign up to statesecretmatchmaker.com. With one swipe, get added to the hottest group chat in the war zone of your choice. Nothing says, yeah, man, like seeing the vice president launch a missile in Yemen with a flippant LOL, or getting horny by moving a carrier group to the Horn of Africa with an eggplant emoji. So, shake that digi-booty and sign up now for unbridled OPSEC for all the goss on subs, drones, tanks and sorties. Log on to statesecretmatchmaker.com for hardcore defense texting.
Thank you, Robbie McGregor, for that. I've always wanted to do a gay matchmaker parody, and thankfully the two things combined. The election is likely to be called tomorrow at the time of recording, and our two guests spend their time trying to figure out basically what people want and who they're going to vote for. So, Alex and Ed, what the hell do people want and who are they going to vote for?
Well, the short answer, and this is a global trend, is people want nothing and they don't want to vote for anyone. So this is really what makes this a unique election. So you can see globally, there's obviously a big swing against incumbents. If you are the government, then it's not good news for you, regardless if you're doing a good job or a bad job. And the question is, for a country like Australia where people have to go up and vote, where does that vote go? People don't want to really send it to any of the major parties, and that's going to be the big trend.
Alex, so what do you reckon? I mean, you spent all your time wading through the data. What do you think?
I would preface this by saying that I'm going to give you a snapshot of where we are at this point in the electoral cycle, and things do change. I think there is kind of that global anti-incumbency trend, but you also see the occasional bucking of the trend, such as in Mexico, when a very progressive government delivered various things for the electorate and were rewarded as a result. And I think we're going to see here a lot of sort of very confusing signals that can be overinterpreted. And the signals we're getting at the moment are signals that occur before the election's been called. So people's minds haven't completely been turned to the choice. And I do think we're going to see some movement after the election's called.
I mean, that could be as early as tomorrow. So you think the whole game could be changed from tomorrow on?
Not that the whole game could be changed, but that things do shift once people begin to pay attention, because we're pretty unusual in terms of being interested in politics all the time. Most people really aren't.
Alex, what is wrong with these people? Can we do some research to figure out what's wrong with those people that aren't interested in politics all the time?
They're not listening right now, surely, so we can say whatever we want about those
Yeah,
people.
they would ask what's wrong with us, right? Because what they are.
I think they're right, by the way.
Right? So they're interested in the political issues, and you will always get them animated about political issues, and they will often have very sophisticated takes and analyses of those issues. What they can't stand is the process. They hate kind of the horse race aspect of it, the kind of gamification of politics that sickos like us might be more into. Yeah.
They hate the horse race. That's all we live for. All we live for is the horse race. That's ridiculous.
Maybe if we could encourage more gambling on federal politics, then there'd be a lot more political engagement. No, they say a day is a long time in politics, and we'll probably have at least 33 more of them. But just to put that in context and why it's wonderful to work on Australian politics, Joe Biden's, which turned into Kamala Harris's campaign, was launched 507 days before the actual election. So while it will seem like a very long month or so to Australians, we can all be thankful that it's not 500 days.
Oof.
Imagine 500 days of arguing over nuclear. I mean, it feels like it's already been 500 days of arguing over nuclear. What are some of the biggest trends you kind of seen heading into this weird election period now? Like, at this point in time, is there something that's really tracking that's kind of interesting that people aren't really paying attention to?
I think there's not anywhere near enough attention paid to the electorate sense of informational overwhelm and their retreat from the contested spaces, the contested political spaces. They find it very hard to know whom to trust because, as far as they're concerned, politicians are, by definition, not trustworthy. So with politicians kind of arguing with each other, people just switch off. And it's a really interesting kind of piece of received wisdom that people say they don't like negative campaigning, but it really does work. And I think that might have been true before we had this kind of cornucopia of information or content available to us. Now people really can just flick past it.
Ed, you are an information king, or rather the disinformation king. You wrote the book on disinformation, facts and other lies. Have you seen this kind of trend as well? Like, have you seen like information overload for the electorate, or vice versa? Is there too much disinformation in the electorate?
The difference between misinformation and disinformation is deliberate, whereas misinformation, like you two fine journalists might make an unintended error and then issue a correction. I'm sure it's never happened.
How dare you, Ed? All the misinformation we put out is deliberate. We are a direct propaganda network and we keep our overlords happy.
And this is why you thrive during elections, because this is exactly the point. The information overload is
I should just say a big shout out to Barbara, who became a Patreon supporter this week. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
If you've got any special messages we need to put in the next week's podcast, let us know.
Thank you for becoming one of our corporate overlords.
Thank you, Barbara. Is Barbara real? Is Barbara a bot? You know, that's the question that we need to ask these elections. No. So information overload is actually part of the plan, right? So there's famously Steve Bannon, if I can swear on your podcast, I'm sure I can, says flood the zone with shit, right? And the expanded explanation of that is if we keep just talking about nonsense all the time at volume, nobody will ever realise what we're actually doing. And so information overload is part of the plan. You saw this, you know, the most recent election that we had at a national scale was obviously the referendum in 2023, and there was just a lot of shit that flooded the zone, and most of it was not true, but it was all part of that plan. So the political actors that want to, you know, be successful, they know that people are up to the back teeth with cost of living anxiety. They are overloaded with information. They are decreasingly trusting politicians and political institutions, but they leverage that. That's going to be the feelings that people want to tap into. That's why it's really hard to be an incumbent, because you can't say, yeah, we hate the government too, but that's also us. You know, we saw this with Trump, right? It was like, tear it all down. These people are not really working for you. And people bought that. That was more important to them than, will Trump do better? No, of course not. But they bought into that grievance.
Yeah, and we've got two career politicians really now going head to head. It certainly doesn't feel like we have the outsider, although I guess for us, the outsiders are the independents.
Yeah. And that's, you know, that will become the big question for this election. So there was, you know, what's the zeitgeist, right? The zeitgeist in 2022 was everybody can roundly agree we hate Scott Morrison, right? And that's the vein that taps. So, you know, the question this time will be, everyone is broadly, universally pissed off with the status quo. Is that going to see people flood to the independents as a solution?
We saw this week, in terms of information flows, a whole group of influencers being invited to the budget lockup.
Not enough, in my opinion. What about
there was noticeably one political podcast that didn't get invited. I don't know who that was. Yeah, multiple award winning 4 times in a row. No one gave us a call.
Couldn't believe it. What I saw, and this is like no disrespect to any of like whatever these. It was just when I saw someone who was there who was like TikToker and Lululemon ambassador was invited into the thing, and I'm like, I'm angry now twice. 1, that I wasn't invited. 2, that I don't get any free Lululemon.
You weren't added to the Signal chat about the invites? I thought you guys were there.
Oh, I'm in that. I know exactly when the attacks are happening. I'm just not getting any free leggings.
I think is this a smart move? I mean, I listen to Glenn James's My Money podcast and Hannah Ferguson more than I listen to 2GB or watch Channel 9. Is this a smart move, Alex? Do you think this is a smart move bringing influencers into the budget lockup?
Up to a point, sure. The influencers or content creators, or all of these non-traditional media producers are incredibly important, and they are, of course, consumed a lot more than traditional media. Whether the budget itself can be turned into content that people want to consume is another story.
That is so right, Alex. Like, we don't even look at it because it's such a boring story.
Oh, is someone going to do a winners and losers column? That's what I'm really hanging out to see every year.
But it seemed that the rest of the media got really upset that they were invited. Like, there were so many columns about influencers going into the budget lockup that were they jealous? Like, what? Why is the Australian Financial Review jealous of these influencers, Ed?
Well, they know the future, right? Like, these influencers are the media, and nobody's picking up a paper. If there were no cafes, then nobody would buy a print, issue of the Australian Financial Review, right? So, I don't know how many people, like randomly, let's pick a small outlet, maybe the Canberra Times might have sent someone to the budget lockup, and all of about 30 or 40,000 people probably read that every day. Whereas Hannah Ferguson is talking to, you can fact check me here, about 1.3 million people. I don't know. But my point is, the audience.
It sounds good. Yeah. Thanks for that disinformation, Ed Coker.
You introduced me as a disinformation czar. She actually has 1.3 billion followers, which is much more than the 13 that read the Canberra Times. But my point is to say that is the media. Right. So it shouldn't shock us. I think what should shock us is how surprising it is to the mainstream media that and I've been to these budget lockups, right? They let in people like me. They let in anyone, right? It's not just papers. It's interest groups. It's lobbies, all of the kind of ecosystem around that can go to the budget lockup. So the fact that the mainstream media think that it's news that, a finance podcast would be interested in inviting and talking to this, but it's not news about who everyone else is in the room that time. That's the more shocking thing.
Alex, you do heaps and heaps of focus groups. What does that process look like, and what are people saying to folks at RedBridge this election?
No, my internet's just crapped out.
I'll field this one. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, no worries.
I'd say NBN is top of mind for people right now. Reliable internet connection is the number one issue that people are talking about.
Alex is back. There we go. Hello, Alex.
So focus groups are when you get a small group of people carefully selected to represent the demographics and or voting intentions, whatever the characteristics you are that you want to study, get them into a room. You have a 90-minute conversation with them, and you find out about what's important to them in a directed discussion. And I always marvel at how generous people are with the information that they want to provide, how thoughtful they are almost all of the time as well. And they feel, if I had to characterise it in one word, abandoned by the political class. And where people feel abandoned by the political class, incumbents do tend to cop it. However, there is not any great sense that the opposition is the answer to that either. The major parties are grouped together as constituting a duopoly, and people often compare them to Woolies and Coles and feel similarly fleeced.
Yeah, we've got a major problem with duopoly in our industry. Like Hamish and Andy have had a lock on so much comedy.
Do Hamish and Andy count as a duopoly, or are they one side of a duopoly?
Are they just an
Are you kidding?
opoly?
Andy hosts shows. Hamish hosts shows.
Yeah, oh, sure. Okay, yeah,
Who
yeah.
else is out? There's no one else to host a show. You want to pitch a show? You're either going to need a Hamish or an Andy. Forget it. They must be ended. How do we end Hamish and Andy?
Is Aldi, I guess, coming through from the side.
Abandonment is a really interesting phrase, Alex. Ed, does that ring true to things that you're seeing on the ground?
Yes, and a lot of people in the inner cities, especially the affluent areas, are just calling out for Harris Farms. I'm actually, that'd be a good research study to do. Let's do the correlation of Harris Farms location to Teal vote. I think we'd find something there. Absolutely, the abandonment, right? So the question is, like, people have to do something with their vote, and they won't want to. And what do? Normally, in a conventional election like this in Australia, you would see the vote of one major party deplete and the other major party increase. And that's not going to happen. Like, keep an eye on the primary vote, which is what people put one next to at the night. You might find one party wins the election, but both of their votes go down. We are very lucky to live in a preferential voting system where those preference flows will sort themselves out. But that's going to be the big reaction from people. They don't want to vote for anyone. They're pissed off at everyone and don't feel like anyone is speaking for them. So who speaks for them? That will be the question that they'll be asking.
I mean, we've spoken a little bit about independence this podcast, but is somebody like Clive Palmer a real concern? Like, is Clive Palmer a serious candidate given what he's trying to do?
Well, if we want to run the experiment of, like, what if we gave Clive Palmer hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on getting his message to every Australian, would it work? No. We're very lucky that Clive Palmer writes his own ads and they're very ineffective. What we should be worried about is if he gave that money to someone who knew what they were doing, could they be effective in tapping the grievance vote? Yes, absolutely, especially post-pandemic where, grievance politicians have been largely rewarded globally. Trump is the famous example that you don't have to come along and offer any solutions. In fact, his policy platform in the middle of a cost of living crisis was, I will make everything more expensive in America. And he still got elected, right, because he tapped into that grievance. So Clive Palmer is an amusing and distracting sideshow, but is it possible that someone with his deep pockets could come along and be much more effective? Absolutely.
Although I will point out, I think there's something that I refer to as robust sentiment, and there's pretty robust sentiment around Clive Palmer, right? So there's not a whole lot, I don't think, that he could do to shift perceptions of him. And the sort of grievance politics that plays really well in the US, it doesn't gain the same purchase here. It's not that there isn't grievance stuff happening here. It's that we're firstly not as far down the kind of neoliberal hell path as the US. So there's also a different kind of national character. So, for example, when someone like Dutton tries to leverage grievance against dual nationals, the response is not kind of the far-right embrace that one might expect in the electorate. People really were, even people who weren't dual citizens, their sense of decency was offended by the suggestion. And people have a perception of politicians as inherently power hungry. And so the idea that politicians would want to take, the power to strip citizenship away from judges and take that power for themselves, people use the words terrifying, it's scary. What else are they going to try to do? And these are not particularly engaged people.
It's super interesting. It does feel like in some ways we are lucky in a lot of areas, particularly that Dutton is just quite bad at being Trump. Like, If I was looking at the Trump lesson, flooding the zone with shit, bashing immigrants, it's such a weird niche thing. Like, just go out and say immigrants are ruining the country. You're probably going to do okay. It's worked in the past. You can see it. It's getting some purchase in the housing crisis. People are blaming immigrants for the housing crisis, even though there's very little evidence or no evidence to suggest it makes any real difference to the housing crisis. But there's a logic to it. Add more people, fewer houses. Like, if you don't think about it for too long, people can think that makes sense. But dual national, it's such a weird niche choice of racism.
What are you trying to do?
He's like a racism sommelier at this point. He's just got, he's tried all of the different racisms and none of them are working for him anymore. And now he's looking for weirder and weirder types of racism.
I know. I mean, when Russell Crowe heard this, he threw a phone right through the Dixon office. It was
That is the most out-of-date joke I have heard on this podcast in some time. And that's saying something.
Well, we haven't had Chris Taylor on for a long time, so
The Russell Crowe phone throwing affair was what, 1999?
I don't know.
But even with that kind of the immigrants are causing the housing crisis, even that needs a bit of nuance on it, because people's objection isn't to migrants per se, it's to just more people coming. So it's born of a resource competitive mindset rather than any racialized mindset. And that's actually a really important distinction, and it's one I think the Liberals are failing to make.
But I want to use one example of Peter Dutton's failed policy attempt at a particular grievance to say that grievance politics doesn't work in Australia. I think that also that policy involved sending people back to another referendum in Australia, which is probably not the way to tap the current mood of the nation.
And it's such a strange policy, right? Like if you are a dual citizen like me, like if I had Lebanese citizenship, I don't, and I was like, well, I'd done something naughty. I might as well revoke my Lebanese citizenship. That way I could stay in Australia. or you're basically asking a nation of immigrants to think about whether they should get deported or not. It feels like it's the dumbest thing ever.
And no one thinks of this as a problem. No one is waking up in the morning going, oh my God, what if a dual national hits me with their car? Or what if my house gets robbed by a dual national? Like, it's just such a weird, there's no fear of that. If you're trying to find fears and like wedge them open, no one's afraid of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would be afraid of the CEO if the CEO of Woolworths was also the CEO of Coles. I mean, that would make complete sense. We should deport
That'd be a duopoly.
Duopoly, that's it.
Well, there's a John Howard playbook, right? But there's a problem with continually going back to the John Howard playbook, in as much as so many of the voters that voted for John Howard are no longer with us. We have a completely different electorate now. We have so many new people on the roll. We have not just younger people, but also migrants. We've got a completely different complexion in terms of the electorate. And so, yeah, this kind of almost compulsive reversion to the Howard tactics is an interesting choice.
So we're dealing with so many of his problems that he created now with, things like the housing crisis, which, really weirdly took off right after halving that capital gains tax discount. But he was, sitting on a pretty good wicket, you would say, economically, with resources booms and lots of. So he didn't really. He had such an easy job in some ways, and it's very to go back to that playbook now. It's like no, like as you say, the world. Not only are the voters dead, the world's different. The world that he was living in was pretty easy to be a politician.
I think just to not misuse data here, but Alex is saying that when people voted for John Howard, they died. So I would just say that is a big
causality.
We don't know, but the data is clear that following the John Howard playbook and voting for him will cause death.
Unfortunately, John Howard himself remains alive.
That's scary. Why doesn't Peter Dutton stop this death thing that's going around?
What's next? Labor's going to tax it?
I mean, we've seen time and time again Labor make missteps around environment and climate while they've been in power. One of the things Labor kind of was selling last time around was their environmental chops. Why do you think Labor are making all these missteps on climate to people who want to see more action on climate? Why do they think they're a bit untouchable on this issue when clearly a lot of the electorate are interested in climate action?
Well, it's hard to be all things to all people. And in politics, you've got to do the art of making a decision on who you're going to piss off and when. And the decisions that Labor have made on that have relied on the assumption that ultimately if people depart them to more progressive parties, they will get the preference votes back. And it's more important for them to, say, shore up the WA vote which is a particular high watermark that they're experiencing over there. And they picked up a couple of seats last time that they didn't expect to get, and they're very keen to hold them. So they're making the raw political calculation that there's more to gain than there is to lose in that, rather than what some people might prefer them to do, which is to make the moral, judgment on what is the right thing to do and what was their policy platform going into the election. That's politics.
I think we're all very much products of our social groups, our information ecosystems, and they have a pretty unusual information ecosystem and social existence, which is each other and the media class. And there's a whole lot of things that occupy them that do not occupy ordinary voters. And so they might be making certain calculations that don't necessarily gel with key elements of the electorate, because not all the contests are going to be with Liberal. Some of them are going to be with Green as well. And it's a real choice to be kind of mired in the traditional media's framing of jobs in WA and neglect those electoral considerations.
All right, we are potentially 33 days away from an election. We'll find out tomorrow. Let's get some predictions out of the way. Ed and Alex, what are your big predictions for this election?
I think Donald Trump will win, narrowly sweeping the swing states and presenting it as a landslide. No, look, one of the unique things about this election is that all scenarios are possible, and it's much harder to predict this one than usual. I think the most likely outcome at this stage will be a Labor minority government. It's hard to see either party getting a majority in their own right, but that could come down to a handful of seats in terms of who finishes with more seats and not a majority.
Alex, what do you think?
I'm particularly interested in also the psychology of the political operators and whether they get into, again, information ecosystems that don't serve them well in the electorate but do serve them well in the party room, and the gap between those two things. I think that's something really interesting to watch. What are they focusing on and obsessing over versus what real people, in inverted commas, are thinking and saying?
What's a great example, Alex, of that dichotomy? Like, what's a great example of what the political class worry about but no one actually gives a fuck?
So, I mean, look, that dual citizen thing is just about as good as it gets.
I don't even think the Liberal Party gave a shit about that. That was like one man. That was a real captain's call. People seem baffled by that.
The captain's call,
And not to be flippant, but pretty much anything that is kind of occupying people in terms of, the political contest, it's just not making it onto people's radars at all.
All right. Well, I'm excited for the next 33 days. Lewis, do you feel better prepared for the next 33 days?
I don't know. I kind of just want it to be over. I don't.
The election hasn't even started yet. You want it to be finished.
I know. I don't do this because I enjoy it. I just do this because I can't not think about it. Doesn't make me happy, Dan.
I agree too. As soon as the election's over, I'm going to go on at least a 3-day holiday with my wife somewhere, so we don't have to think about this anymore.
Domestically, probably, if you don't cancel your dual citizenship, it might cost you a leave.
I'm ruling out Beirut. That is it for Irrational Fear. Big thank you to Ed Coper from Populares and Alex Fein from RedBridge. What would you folks like to plug? Alex, do you want to plug anything?
No, I have nothing to plug other than the RedBridge Substack is full of excellent insights like the ones I've been sharing here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the RedBridge Substack. We'll chuck that in the show notes. Ed, do you have anything to plug?
Go vote, people. Go vote.
And Ed, you've got a bit of an American expert coming out to talk to us about...
Thank you, Dan. You can lead a horse to water. Thank you for reminding me. I do have something to plug. We are flying out Kamala Harris's campaign guru, who is responsible for raising over $1 billion US, which is about 40 trillion Australian dollars at the current exchange rate, in grassroots small donor fundraising. So if you are a practitioner to that area, you want to hear from him, we're going to do events in Sydney and Melbourne next week. Go on to the Populares LinkedIn page. You'll find all of the events there.
Yeah, we'll chuck that in the show notes too. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Alex. Lewis, do you want to plug anything?
Well, don't forget to come to Irrational Fear live at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival on April 9. April 9 at the
6:45.
Malthouse Theatre. That'll be really fun. And I'm on doing another show as well with Michael Hing on Good Friday, if you would like to come to that, at Comedy Republic.
Yes, big thank you to Road Mics, our Patreon supporters, Jacob Brown on the Teppanyaki timeline. I'm recording my end of A Rational Fear on Gundungurra and Tharawal's land. Big thank you to Robbie McGregor too, who gave us that explicit voiceover at the start of the show.
Explicit or exquisite or both?
Exquisite and explicit voiceover at the start of the show. He was so excited to do a parody of Gay Matchmaker, which he hasn't done since 2005. And I did look up that Russell Crowe reference. That was also a 2005 reference. So, hey, it wasn't 1999, Lewis. It was 2005. So it wasn't, so long in the tooth.
Happy 20th anniversary gag, Dan. That's why you really brought it up. I know we were all marking that anniversary in our calendars.
See you next time. Bye.